The farm sat in a narrow Appalachian valley where the fog arrived early and lingered late, and where sound, especially at dusk, seemed to travel farther than it should. Claire noticed that before anyone else. In the evenings, while she washed dishes at the kitchen sink, she could hear the creak behind the barn from nearly half a mile away, moving softly over stone in the dark, like someone whispering in another room. Sometimes a truck would pass somewhere beyond the hills, and the sound would drift through the valley for so long that it no longer resembled an engine at all. But weather. Even the dogs from distant farms carried strangely there. Their barking arrived thin and mournful through the trees, as though the night itself were trying to imitate them. Evan loved the place immediately. He loved the isolation of it, the long gravel road, the leaning red barn, the pasture that rolled unevenly toward the woods. He loved the silence after sunset and the darkness that settled completely once the porch lights were off. Claire suspected he loved most of all the feeling that they had finally stepped outside the world a little. The children adapted quickly. Children always do. Liam spent entire afternoons wandering the creek with a fishing rod he rarely used. Nora collected feathers and smooth stones and arranged them carefully along her windowsill upstairs. Jack followed the dog everywhere, disappearing into the tall grass behind the house until Claire called him back at dusk. For a while, the days possessed the gentle unreality of a life people imagine they deserve after becoming tired of modern things. There were fireflies at night. The kitchen radio hummed softly through static while Claire cooked. The children returned home dirty and exhausted and happy in a way children rarely seem anymore. It was beautiful there. That remained true even later, even after everything. Especially after everything, perhaps, because beauty, Claire would eventually think, had very little to do with kindness. The first unsettling moment arrived so quietly that she nearly forgot it afterward. Jack came inside laughing one evening just before dark and announced that there was a man standing near the fence. Claire barely looked up at first. What kind of man? A naked one, he said cheerfully. Evan laughed from the kitchen table without lifting his eyes from the mail. Sure there is. Jack pointed toward the back pasture. He was just standing there looking at me. Then, grinning, he stretched his mouth unnaturally wide and stiffened his arms against his sides in imitation of whatever he had seen. Claire felt something cold move lightly through her chest. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The faint, instinctive discomfort of witnessing a child reproduce an expression that did not belong on a human face. Evan grabbed a flashlight and walked outside before she could say anything further. Claire watched him through the kitchen window as he crossed the pasture toward the fence line, the beam of the flashlight drifting slowly through the grass. Beyond the fence, the woods climbed steeply into darkness. The trees there were dense enough that twilight collected beneath them early, forming pockets of shadow long before the sun had fully disappeared from the valley. Watching from the house, Claire found herself thinking that the woods did not look empty exactly. They looked occupied in some quieter way, as though something had withdrawn deeper among the trees at Evan's approach, and was now observing him from a distance so natural it no longer resembled hiding. He returned 10 minutes later and told them there was nobody out there. Still, before bed, he locked the back door twice. That night the dog refused to come inside. Murphy stood at the edge of the porch with his ears lowered and his body perfectly still, staring toward the house with an expression Claire found difficult to explain afterward. It was not aggression, nor was it simple fear. It resembled concentration, as though the dog had become aware of something subtle and terrible, and was waiting for the humans around him to notice it too. Evan eventually dragged him inside by the collar. Murphy disappeared beneath the kitchen table and remained there all night. Around 2 a.m, Claire woke briefly and became aware of movement somewhere downstairs. At first she mistook it for the ordinary shifting noises of an old farmhouse settling in the cold. Then she realized the sound possessed rhythm. Not footsteps exactly. Weight. Careful weight moving across old floorboards. The sounds were sparse and separated by long intervals of silence, but each carried the strange intimacy of movement inside a familiar house. Claire lay beside her sleeping husband, listening to the occasional creak rise softly through the dark. And after several minutes, she became aware of another detail that disturbed her far more deeply than the sounds themselves. Whatever was moving downstairs did not seem lost. It moved with patience, with the quiet confidence of something already familiar with the shape of the rooms. In the morning she said nothing about it. Daylight altered the emotional proportions of everything. The valley looked beautiful again beneath the pale gold light of early autumn. Mist drifted low across the pasture. The children laughed somewhere near the creek. Evan repaired part of the fence, while Nora sat nearby, threading flowers through the wire. Claire almost convinced herself that the unease from the previous night belonged to exhaustion and unfamiliarity and too much darkness. Then, while pouring coffee, she noticed Liam standing motionless at the kitchen window. "What are you looking at?" He hesitated before answering. "I thought somebody was standing out there." Claire followed his gaze toward the fence line. Nothing moved in the pasture. Still, she found herself staring much longer than necessary. That afternoon she drove into town for groceries. The cashier at the small market recognized the address immediately when Claire mentioned where they lived now. "The Bell place," the woman said quietly. Claire smiled politely. "I guess so." The cashier nodded while bagging groceries. "You folks settling in all right?" "So far." Another pause. Then, "Those woods make people uneasy." Claire laughed softly, expecting the woman to smile in return. She didn't. Instead, she looked absently toward the windows near the front of the store, where the late afternoon sky had already begun dimming over the hills. "My grandfather used to say, 'Valleys keep things,'" she said. "Sounds, weather. Sometimes worse things than that." Driving home later, Claire found herself unable to stop glancing toward the tree line. The woods seemed different at dusk, not threatening exactly, only patient. That evening the silence arrived early. No insects hummed in the fields, no frogs called from the creek. Even the wind seemed to diminish gradually until the entire valley settled into a stillness so complete that Claire became aware of the blood moving faintly inside her own ears. They were sitting on the porch when the voice called softly from the woods. "Mom?" Nora looked up immediately from the cards in her lap. The voice had been hers. But Nora sat beside Claire beneath the porch light. No one moved at first. Then, from farther down the fence line, "Mom." The second call sounded wrong in a manner so subtle Claire would spend years afterward trying unsuccessfully to describe it. The voice itself was nearly perfect. The problem lay somewhere beneath it, hidden within the shape of the sound rather than the sound itself. It resembled hearing somebody speak your language fluently, while somehow misunderstanding the emotional purpose behind the words. Evan stood so quickly his chair tipped backward. Inside. The children obeyed at once. Doors locked, curtains drawn. Nobody spoke much afterward. Jack asked twice whether someone was outside. Claire told him probably not, though even while speaking she had the uncomfortable sensation that the house itself was listening carefully to her answer. Sometime after midnight, soft knocking sounded from the front porch. 3 measured taps against the wood. Murphy growled quietly beneath the table. The knocking came again. Then Liam's voice drifted through the door. "Dad?" Liam sat frozen beside Claire on the couch. The voice outside waited several seconds before speaking again. "Dad, let me in." Evan would later insist there had been something deeply unnatural about the tone, though when Claire asked him to explain what he meant, he could never fully manage it. Eventually he settled on the only description that seemed remotely accurate. "It sounded," he said, "like somebody smiling too hard while they talked." No one approached the door. Outside, the porch boards creaked softly beneath shifting weight. Then came a long, dragging sound against the wood. Not violent, curious, like fingers moving slowly across a surface they did not entirely understand. The scratching continued intermittently for nearly an hour, each sound separated by long stretches of silence, during which Claire found herself imagining something standing patiently on the porch just beyond the thin barrier of the front door, listening to the breathing inside the house and learning from it. Morning arrived pale and exhausted. The porch stood empty, the yard untouched. For several minutes Claire almost felt embarrassed by the previous night, by the intensity of their fear, by the irrational atmosphere the darkness had allowed them to create around ordinary sounds. Then they realized Murphy was gone. Evan found him near the fence line shortly after sunrise. Later, Claire would notice that her husband never described what he saw there directly. He approached the memory carefully, circling it through implication and omission, the way people do around experiences the mind has not fully agreed to contain. The dog's body had not been mutilated. That was the worst part. Nothing obvious had happened to it. The skin looked strangely undisturbed. The limbs lay naturally. Even the eyes remained open with a softness that resembled sleep. And yet Evan returned from the pasture, visibly altered by what he had seen. "There was something wrong with the face," he said quietly. He never explained further than that. By afternoon they had decided to leave. The children sensed the seriousness immediately. Liam stopped asking questions. Nora remained close enough to Claire that their sleeves brushed whenever they moved through the house together. On the kitchen table, half buried beneath the day's mail, an envelope, cream-coloured, with a return address printed in small type. Harrow Lake Foundation, Grant Administration, Pacific Northwest. Claire moved past it without picking it up. Outside, fog began gathering unusually early along the fence line. It accumulated slowly among the trees in pale layers until the woods themselves appeared to dissolve into whiteness. Then Jack pointed toward the pasture. At first, Claire thought the fog had begun taking shapes naturally in the fading light. Then she realized 5 figures were standing near the fence, watching the house. No one spoke. The distance concealed details, but not proportions. The figures resembled people closely enough that Claire's eyes kept trying instinctively to organize them into familiarity. Despite the growing certainty that something about their stillness was profoundly wrong. One of them lifted an arm eventually and waved toward the house. The gesture contained an awful politeness, not mockery, practice, as though it had observed the movement many times before and was quietly pleased to have reproduced it successfully. Darkness settled over the valley soon afterward. The figures disappeared into it completely. Or perhaps they remained there. None of them looked again long enough to know. That night, Claire woke to the sound of her own voice downstairs. Soft laughter drifting upward through the floorboards. For several seconds she remained suspended between sleep and waking, listening to the familiar cadence of herself moving faintly through the kitchen below. Then understanding arrived. Beside her, Evan was already awake. The laughter stopped. A moment later, her voice called gently from downstairs, "Everything's all right." Claire felt the entire house become still around the words. Not silent, attentive, as though the darkness in the rooms beyond the bedroom had leaned closer to listen. Again her own voice floated upward, warmer this time, closer. "You can come down now." Evan gripped her wrist hard enough to hurt. Neither of them moved. Outside the bedroom, the floorboards creaked once softly beneath shifting weight. Then came a long silence, during which Claire became aware of something that frightened her more deeply than any voice or figure or impossible event had yet managed to do. Some part of her wanted to answer, not because she believed it was truly herself downstairs, because the voice sounded lonely, and whatever stood below them in the dark had learned enough already to understand that loneliness itself could be used like a door. People still drive through that valley occasionally. The road remains open. The farmhouse still stands beyond the fence line, its porch light glowing softly after dark. Some claim a family lives there now. Others insist the place has been abandoned for years. Stories differ. That is the nature of stories. But there are people in town who will quietly tell you never to stop along that stretch of road after sunset. No matter how welcoming the house appears from a distance, and no matter who might be standing near the fence, waving slowly through the fog, especially if they sound familiar, especially if they call your name in a voice that belongs to someone you love.